Welcome back, everybody. My name is Tucker, and today I wanted to talk about Anthony Davis and his trade request and all that, which I've already talked about in a previous video, but this is going to be different than any other Anthony Davis video that you're going to see around, because I'm going to talk about three teams that are not the Boston Celtics and are not the LA Lakers that could create a super team by trading for Anthony Davis. Now, just so we're clear before I actually get into this is a fairly loose definition of a super team, in that there are three all-star caliber players, or going to be three all-star caliber players in each of these scenarios on the teams that I'm talking about, and none of these trades would happen until the 2019 offseason. None of these moves would happen until then. This would not be before this trade deadline. This is moving forward. This is looking towards the future in terms of possible destinations for Anthony Davis to go and create a super team. With all that said, let's go ahead and start with our first team, and that is the Denver Nuggets. Now, for each of these teams, I'm going to talk about how they would get to creating this super team and what they would try and trade to New Orleans for Anthony Davis. I'm not saying that these trades would 100% happen, but this is the package that each of these teams could put together. And then I'm just going to talk about these super teams and some of the issues, some of the benefits that they may have moving forward. And in this scenario, as you can see on screen, the Nuggets would trade Jamal Murray, Gary Harris, Michael Porter Jr., Malik Beasley, and a 2021 top 5 protected first-round pick in exchange for Anthony Davis. And then after that, they would package together some second-round picks to try and dump Mason Plumlee's $14 million expiring deal for the 2019-20 season, and then they would decline Paul Millsap's near $30 million team option also for the 2019-20 season. And the reason they would do this is because after trading for Davis, and then obviously still having Nikola Jokic on the roster, they would have $30 million in cap space in the summer of 2019 to try and sign a third player, whatever player that may be. You could take it a bit further than that and say if they were able to get rid of someone like Will Barton's contract, then that would help them create even more cap space, potentially have max room as opposed to near max room, which is what $30 million would be. But that would still be plenty to bring in an all-star caliber player, or even if they chose to bring in maybe some more complementary players around those two stars in the front court. And speaking of the front court, that's really the first issue here, is I don't really necessarily think that Anthony Davis and Nikola Jokic would struggle to coexist. I think they would be a good fit together. I think the bigger issue is just that you're turning 4 perimeter players into 1 player in the front court, and you already have a strong front court player in Nikola Jokic, who's going to be an All-NBA player this season. And then, as I said, in terms of drawbacks to this, maybe you could see Anthony Davis and Nikola Jokic struggling to coexist and that fit being a bit questionable in the front court. Me personally, I think it would be interesting to see, and I would like to see it. And I don't have a ton of concerns about their ability to coexist. They're both very versatile players. They both can space the floor, but they both can pass. And Davis is obviously outstanding defensively. So I do think that would work. And that isn't as much of a concern for me, but if it is for you, I completely understand it. And then the benefit of this, obviously the reason why the Nuggets would do it, is if they were able to get a star level player on the perimeter, then this would, in my opinion, raise the ceiling of their current team, especially if they're able to keep around Will Barton. That would give them insert free agent perimeter player here, Will Barton, and then obviously Davis and Jokic, and then they can build around from there. And that would, in my opinion, raise their ceiling, because even as good as the Denver Nuggets have played so far this season, I personally don't think, even if the Golden State Warriors did not exist, I'm not that high on the Nuggets' chances of potentially making the finals, much less competing for an overall NBA championship with this current roster, and they don't really have a ton of mobility without making some moves like this to try and improve their roster. Obviously, declining Millsap's option would be a good start. Dumping Plumlee's contract would open up the same amount of cap space, but having a player, a top 5 caliber NBA player in Anthony Davis on their roster would certainly raise their ceiling. And if they were able to properly fill out their team with the cap space that they create, then this could potentially bring a super team to Denver. Now, the other big issue with this, if we're talking about free agents, is whether or not Denver would be able to attract a big time free agent, because even though from a basketball perspective it might make sense, the Nuggets are not really known as a big free agency destination, especially compared to some of the other cities that have a ton of cap space this summer. So those would be the big obstacles to me, at least in my mind, for this super team scenario to develop for Denver. But again, this is really about more of a hypothetical fantasy team building experience than anything else, and this could create a super team if the Nuggets decided to trade for Anthony Davis. Next up is a team that's going to be involved in a lot of these super team kind of discussions over the next handful of months, and that is the LA Clippers. And the reasoning for this is because they have a ton of flexibility, a ton of assets, and a ton of cap space. Now, in terms of the trade, the Clippers would sign and trade Tobias Harris, send Jerome Robinson, Shai Gilgeous-Alexander, and once again a 2021 top 5 protected first-round pick for Anthony Davis. After making this deal for Davis, the focus for them in terms of building their team is going to be, as it will be for the next couple of months anyway, focused on free agency. They'll have the ability to sign a max level player in 2019 as well as 2020 once some of their other contracts like Danilo Gallinari come off the books. So they could sign one of those bigger name free agents that have been linked to them, whether it be Kevin Durant, Kawhi Leonard, Kyrie Irving, Jimmy Butler, any of those guys. They could sign him to play along with Anthony Davis as well as Lou Williams, Danilo Gallinari, guys like that they're able to keep. Then once those players come off the books in 2020, sign another big star, and that would be when their super team would be created in 2020, which granted is a year after either of these other two teams have created their quote-unquote super team officially, but this would still be a very, very good Clippers roster next year with insert free agent here, Anthony Davis, and some of the other players that they were able to keep and not have to give up for Davis. The risk here is that presumably they would have to make the trade for Davis before having any kind of guarantee of signing any of the other players in free agency and having no guarantee that Davis himself would return to the team when he becomes a free agent in 2020. But even with that said, I would imagine that with Anthony Davis being on the Clippers via trade, that would attract some free agency interest and they would be able to get somebody, one of those 4 guys that I talked about, to join them in 2019, and then in 2020 they could get maybe a bit more of a complementary star to finish out their super team and move forward with one of the better teams in the league. And last up now is probably the most interesting of all of these super team scenarios, and that is the New York Knicks. Now, first step, just like for the other 2 teams, is trading for Anthony Davis, and in this circumstance they would trade Frank Ntilikina, Kevin Knox, Mitchell Robinson, Courtney Lee, and their unprotected 2019 first-round pick. Now, on the surface, from a player standpoint, this deal is not as good for the Pelicans as either of the other 2 teams would have been able to offer, much less the Lakers or the Celtics or any other teams like that. But that first-round pick and the possibility and the likelihood for it to be a top 5, top 3, potentially the first overall pick really increases the value of this trade package to the Pelicans. And not to mention that Kevin Knox and Mitchell Robinson are 2 high potential young players for the Knicks moving forward. And I know that some of you are already thinking right now, why is Kristaps Porzingis not involved in this trade package? And that's because that kind of ruins the whole super team thing of having KPAD and then insert free agent here, which I'm going to talk about in a second. I think if the Knicks, like if this is on draft night or something and the Knicks are holding the first overall pick and someone like Zion Williamson is staring the Pelicans in the face, I think that's the best asset that anybody could trade for Anthony Davis across the entire league if the Knicks ended up with that pick and were willing to trade it. I think that would be more valuable than anything individually that Boston could trade, anything individually that the Lakers could trade, and anything else that the Knicks would have on their roster, including Kristaps Porzingis, and that's why I think they are legitimately in the sweepstakes if they're willing to trade that pick. And in terms of where the Knicks would go from there, it's pretty obvious. They would trade for Anthony Davis, they would keep Kristaps Porzingis, and then they would sign themselves whichever max contract level free agent they want to in the summer of 2019, whether it be Kyrie, whether it be Kevin Durant, whether it be Kawhi, Jimmy Butler, any of those guys, they would sign one of them, and that would be their core 3, and they would still have players like Alonzo Trier, Tim Hardaway Jr. to just have some semblance of a supporting cast around their main 3 guys. Moving forward, just like for either of the other 2 teams, the issue would be convincing Anthony Davis to stay in 2020, as well as signing their own free agent in 2019. But I think if they were able to get Davis and keep Kristaps, a player like Kyrie Irving could actually consider leaving Boston to play with those 2 guys. So I think that this is maybe not so much a realistic possibility. I don't know if I would use that adjective, but I think it's an intriguing one and something that might become more and more likely depending on where the Knicks pick falls. If, like I said earlier, if that turns into the first overall pick, I think that becomes the most high value asset that could possibly be involved in a Anthony Davis Pelicans trade. And that would kind of be the table turner for me in terms of increasing the odds that the Knicks do end up not only with Anthony Davis, but a super team moving forward. And last up, I did want to save this section to just talk about some teams that maybe you had in mind that should have been in the video that I did leave out. The first up being the Milwaukee Bucks. The reason they're not in this is really 2 reasons. One, they don't really have the assets to trade for Anthony Davis. They would have to trade future picks in 2021 and 2023 because they've already given away their 2019 first round pick. And even players like Eric Bledsoe or Chris Middleton that they could possibly move and have high value for the Pelicans, they are 2019 free agents anyway. They're both probably going to opt out of their deals, or Chris Middleton's going to opt out of his. Eric Bledsoe's a free agent anyway. And other than that, it's like Malcolm Brogdon and Von Maker, and I just don't really see a realistic path for them to be able to get Anthony Davis. And then the other part is they wouldn't have a legitimate third star. They'd have Anthony Davis, they'd have Giannis, but they wouldn't really have the space moving forward, even if they were somehow able to make this trade to get a third star. So that's why the Bucks are not on this. The second team that maybe you thought should have been on the list but wasn't is the Toronto Raptors. Now, the assets are not an issue, and I've talked about this on Twitter as well as in my last Anthony Davis video. I think the Raptors have the kind of assets that they need to start to build a package around things like Pascal Siakam and Fred VanVleet. But it's really just the fact that they wouldn't have a third star. It would be Kawhi if they were able to re-sign him, and then obviously Anthony Davis alongside with him. Not that that wouldn't be a great team, but again, just going by the very loose criteria I mentioned at the beginning of a super team needing 3 all-star level players, I wouldn't necessarily put the Raptors in that category if they were able, even if they were able to trade for Anthony Davis. And last up now with a very similar issue to the Milwaukee Bucks is the Dallas Mavericks. I struggled to come up with a scenario in which they could actually have the assets to trade for Anthony Davis without giving up Luka Doncic, which would kind of defeat the whole purpose of this. And then also they wouldn't have a third star. I don't think a package centering around Harrison Barnes, Dennis Smith Jr., and picks plus Dwight Powell maybe, I don't really think that's enough to get the Pelicans to bite. Considering the other teams out there, LA and Boston, I don't really think that's enough. So, and obviously the issue of them not having a third star either, as I mentioned, that's the reason Dallas is not in this. And then just wrapping up the video, I do want to make the point that obviously these are not necessarily likely scenarios. I'm not saying these are going to be super teams, this is going to happen. It's just kind of fun to look at. Like I said, it's supposed to be a different kind of video than your typical Anthony Davis video, and I just wanted to kind of give a bit of a different perspective, talk about some other teams other than just Boston and LA that could potentially make this move, and how they could build around Davis afterwards in terms of teams that have put themselves in a position to have cap space even after trading for Davis and thus create their super team. And that is going to be the end of today's video, and I thank you all very much for watching. Once again, my name is Tucker. If you missed any of my previous videos, then be sure to check out the boxes on screen. Thanks again, and I'll see you all next time.